Welcome to you from wherever you are, especially welcome to you from New Zealand and from around different parts of the UK and from London. It's really wonderful that you've been able to join us for this workshop on church and commerce, relationships, resilience and recovery. As many of you know, HeartEdge focuses on congregational renewal through the 4 C's of compassion, commerce, culture and congregation. And when James and Sarah and I got together, perhaps at the end of last year, to think what sort of workshop on taking a commerce focus, what it might look like, none of us thought that we would find ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic in which many, of course, of our churches are facing huge upheavals with our buildings out of use and employees furloughed. And we find that many of our existing relationships, commercial relationships, are dormant, and many churches are finding themselves in really strained financial situations. So it's actually a very topical but slightly scary workshop to be exploring in all the unknown and all the uncertainty. But we hope that it will also be a positive workshop where our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, bring all sorts of expertise on this topic, both on the ground and at diocesan level. So I hope it will be engaging for you. At 11 o'clock, as I said, we'll stop the recording and then we'll have a time of questions and answers. Do feel free to get up and stretch at any time if you feel the need for a cup of tea. Yeah, you know, we must take care of our bodies in this time of intense online activity. So please don't worry if you want to take your video off for whatever reason. So it now leaves me to introduce our 3 panelists. Reverend James Houston, who will speak first, has been vicar of St. Paul Old Ford in East London for just over 5 years now. He has been part of the HeartEdge steering group since its inception, and his church has a strong commercial arm. Absolutely fascinating church. If you haven't visited St. Paul Old Ford, I really recommend it. Before ordination, James worked in the social enterprise sector and charity sector, and his MA was on social enterprise movement. Amongst the many tasks of being a parish priest, James is currently working on developing a new social enterprise and launching London's newest floating church, I should say. Then we'll move to Sarah Rogers, also part of our HeartEdge steering group. She runs her own consultancy business called Watermark Associates. Sarah supports cultural, community and faith-based organisations to ensure professional commercial practice aligns with their core values. Sarah specialises in identifying retail and cultural potential, such as developing a music venue, community cafe, gallery or retail space, and integrating it into the overall commercial proposition and visitor experience. And Sarah has most recently supported a £7 million heritage lottery funded church and community regeneration project with St Mary Magdalene Church, Paddington, with the Paddington Development Trust. Once again, a very impressive cafe and cultural space to visit when things go back to the so-called normal, and very specialist in digital strategies. Lots that she could answer questions on there. Also a lecturer in marketing and communications at Oxford Brookes Business School. And finally, last but not least, Georgina Graham has kindly joined us, who is in charge of operational issues for the Archdeaconry of London, taking care of 88 churches across the square mile of the city of Westminster. Georgina proactively focuses on the practical side of buildings and mission to enable parishes to deal with their prophetic and the pastoral. Georgina is also very involved in her own training as a Methodist local preacher. And this very much, I know from my own experience, informs her approach to her job. Helping churches to help others and to lead sustainable lives by using the heritage we are stewards of is a very key focus for Georgina, who formerly worked in aviation for 25 years. So welcome to you all, welcome to our panelists, and with that I shall pass over to James. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. I think when Catherine and Sarah and I first thought about doing something like this, one of the ideas was we might be hosting it in St Paul or Ford, which of course makes it slightly easier to talk about my context, so I could just say, look around you. But I'm going to share a little bit of the story of St Paul's, and some of you might have heard a bit of this at the HeartEdge conference last September, so apologies if there's any repetition. I'm just going to draw out a couple of things that I've been thinking about, particularly in the current environment around church and commerce, and then we'll see how we go from there, I suppose. So as Catherine said, I've been vicar of St Paul's in East London for just over 5 years now. Found myself here as curate beforehand, so I've been here for a total of almost 8 years, 9 years, 9 years. But St Paul's is a typical Victorian church. It was never had a huge congregation, and in the early 90s, part of the roof collapsed, and the small congregation of about 20 people had to move out the building because they couldn't do the work that was necessary. So the building itself was closed then for 13 years. But the congregation had a real passion to see the church building reopened. And that same group of 20 people engaged the community in an 8-year-long fundraising and vision project. And the building itself was reopened at the heart of this community in 2004. And it has a number of interesting elements to it, I think, which make it quite unusual. Within the nave itself, we don't have any land around the church, we just have the church building. But within the church itself, there's a 3-story pod, which we call our ark. And we call it the ark because the vision of the church is to be a place of safety and welcome and refuge for people, as the ark was in the story in Genesis. Within the ark itself, we have a sort of multi-use spaces, which now contain a gym for people with disabilities and life-changing conditions, therapy rooms, counselling rooms. We have an educational charity base in there. We run a cafe ourselves within the space. We have about 40 community groups that, well, until recently, regularly use the space for classes, for exercise groups. We have quite a strong relationship with the local GP surgeries and NHS groups, but also with the local councillors and the sort of local authority figures. So we have quite a range of activities: long-term tenants, short-term tenants, cafe. We have a couple of other things outside of the church building, one of which we're exploring, which Catherine mentioned, is starting a new church on a barge, which will be launched fairly soon, God willing, which is a combination of a new missional space and a commercially viable space as well. And commerce is a really important part of how we see our mission and ministry as a church. And it's important, but I think for 3 reasons particularly. The first of those is that whenever we talk about our mission and ministry as a church, we're very aware that part of our role now is about safeguarding the mission and ministry of the generations that will come after us. We're in a very poor area. St Paul's has always been a very poor parish. And even today, with gentrification sweeping through parts of East London, it still is a poor area. Tower Hamlets has the highest rate of child poverty in the country, for example. And so we don't have, we've never had a huge number of well-off people in the congregation or in the community. And as a locally based church, our congregation reflects the community in that sense. And so we've always felt that it's really important for us to have additional income streams to safeguard the mission and ministry of the generations who will come after us in the life of the church. And that's part of the reason why we value our commercial activity as part of what it means to be church now. I think the other reason is to pick up something that Sam Wells has talked about. I can't remember which book he's talked about this in, but he talks about one of the gifts of churches that do commercial activity being the recognition that we as churches can't do it by ourselves. And I think for me that's extremely profound. You know, we love having our tenants, our partners we call them, in the church building. And we recognise that as a church they do things which we as a church could not do. So the work the educational charity does with the local community, a majority of whom are Bangladeshi Muslim, we as a church would not be able to do. The work the gym does with people with disabilities and life-changing conditions, we don't have the expertise to do that. I mean, Lord have mercy if a church tried to run a gym. I mean, why would we? There are wonderful people there who could do it far better than us. You know, it helps us as a church to realise that actually it's not just about us. It's not just about the church trying to do everything by itself. It's actually more about the church recognising that God is at work in our community in so many ways, and trying to engage with that and partner with those organisations that, whether they know it or not, God is in some sense working through. So, for example, with Ability Bow, the gym in the church, there's a lovely guy called Nathan, he won't mind me mentioning his name, who started coming after he had a horrific motorbike accident. He was pretty much paralysed from the neck down. He's been attending the gym now for a number of years, and with the work that they've done, not only has he regained the use or some use of his body, but actually he's now able to walk up and down the stairs in the church. And you know, for us as a church, I mean, that is the gospel: people getting out of wheelchairs and walking again. And it's always very interesting when I hear wonderful stories from some churches of miraculous healings, as people tell it to me. That's great. And I often come away and I have to think, but we see those sorts of things all the time. Okay, it's not an instant thing. It doesn't take place within the context of a service, but we are blessed through the work of our partner, the gym, Ability Bow, seeing people getting out of wheelchairs and walking. That for us feels like the gospel and the kingdom of God, and God working through those partners. And it's that recognition for us that the mission and the ministry of the church is not something we need to do by ourselves. It's not something we need to hold tightly to ourselves. And the third thing I would say, because I don't want to go on too long at this point, is the wonderful interplay for us between commerce and community and congregation. Through the commercial activities we have, we're able to welcome so many more people into the building. We now have about 25,000 coming through the church each year for all sorts of different things. And what that's meant is it means the boundaries of the congregation have become much more fluid. I'm not going to pretend we see hundreds of people moving from using the cafe to worshipping on a Sunday. We don't. But what we do see is a huge number of people who come regularly to the church for perhaps more commercial activities, describing the church as their church, and feeling very connected to what happens here, not necessarily understanding it, and we probably wouldn't see many on a Sunday from that group, but very much feeling this is their church. And for us as a congregation, what that has helped is it is meant the boundaries at the edges of church congregation have become much more blurred, and that's allowed a greater flow through. So, you know, when the church was reopened in 2004, the first Sunday was that same group of 20 people who closed the church down 13 years earlier. And we're not a church that goes out and hits people over the heads with Bibles and drags them in off the streets. But wonderfully, the church has grown to about 150 people now. And I'm convinced that part of that is because we don't have hard boundaries of what it means to be church. And so that enables the Spirit to draw people in much more easily. And it makes church, frankly, a much more attractive place. But that stems from our doors being open, commercial activity happening, and people coming through initially from that. So those three things, I think, are things that I've been perhaps reflecting on a little bit at the moment. I think that's me.
Lovely. Thank you very much, James. Perhaps we'll move now to Sarah.
Great. I'm unmuted now. It's really great to meet everybody, and I'll introduce myself first, and then I'll give you a little snapshot of my recent project with Grand Junction at St Mary Magdalene in Paddington. What our ambitions were when we opened in September 2019, what's held fast over the past 2 months, and what we're thinking the future might look like. But first, I thought I'd give a little snapshot about myself, because my trajectory to this panel is not an obvious one, and I definitely feel it's been a prophetic one for sitting here today. I came to Europe in the late 1980s as a recent history of art graduate from the USA to run an international artist in residency program in a chateau in the south of France. And I've been involved ever since in one way or another in a varied world of the visual arts, culture, and heritage. I took a year out about 8 years ago to do an immersive Master's of Business Administration, which was an incredibly bold move, one that I regretted at many steps of that year. But it was mostly due to my frustration in not having the language, the business language, and the business confidence and a toolbox to work creatively and as effectively as I wanted to in the arts and in heritage. And the reason why I go back a little bit now in my own reflection is that I think that church leaders all come with a real mix of tools in their toolbox, and I think probably have a lot more at their fingertips in their past careers or their learning or their degrees that they can draw on in times like this. And I think that's it's been an important bit for me to think about, what do I know and who do I know beyond the day-to-day of the current role. So I say it's prophetic. In the last 6 years, I've been working mostly with large urban churches in the UK who have either been interested in putting a commercial or cultural strategy in place or refreshing an existing one. So I've launched several cafes. I've been involved in a gift shop and tower visits in Oxford. I started to work with a big a church in Hammersmith on their conference and events venue, and then most recently with this community and cultural project in Paddington. So my big philosophy is that now, having done a business degree, is that good business practice does underpin it all, but that shouldn't sort of restrict how you work within churches. But it's still pretty fundamental to think about how the cultural and commercial programming can be supported by a robust business plan. And I know these are words that sometimes are a bit scary and it's hard to do that business plan, but they should incorporate, they should naturally fit together, and that's your start point. So but here we are today. And so where does that leave many successful church businesses now that COVID-19 has really forced us to evaluate and reevaluate our strengths and weaknesses, as well as our kind of core community mission? We spend a lot of time, there's a formula for a business model, and how do those steps stack up now? The fundamental question is, you put together a meeting. A lot of churches rely on their meeting room hire for income streams, and here we are running a meeting on Zoom. So will the commercial income streams of 2019 return at all in the way we know them? Or like James has been reflecting on his partnerships, do we need to look harder at our community interests in 2020 and think about where we sit as a building, the heritage and history, the living history around us in our community, and start to draw from that energy. So for me, the reflection is that we build stronger relationships with those community commercial partners, and exactly as James has been saying, to think about how they might facilitate, bring learning, bring communities of their own to our buildings, and to run the cafe or the language class. And as long as these align with our values and vision, we can build sort of stronger partnerships that hopefully will help us ride out these uncertain times. The payoff is, or the flip side of that is, that the income may be less as a result. So you may just have to play off those two elements and think about, what is the outcome that you want. So I think our asset, if we think in business terms, our asset is our community at home and wider. We connect people all over the world now. So post GDPR, those 4 letters that we all just tremble at now. Most charities are reluctant to, or don't have the resources to build or rebuild their databases. But this is essential to maintaining our resilience. Communication is everything. Face-to-face communication, virtual communication. Our web of communication goes much further than the people we speak to in our immediate communities. And we don't know where those drops in the lake or puddle will go. You put something out there on the internet or through a Facebook post like this, and the ripple effect is magic. You know, it comes back in ways a year down the road, 2 months down the road, in ways we don't expect. So my current project at the church in Paddington, it's called St. Mary Magdalene. It's newly restored Heritage Fund grant, building massive restoration project in a stunning grade 1 high Gothic nave, and a very modern annex. So funded by Heritage and Community Funds and launched in September 2019. Community cafe, sponsored by Power to Change. So all of the dynamics that you'd expect for a big success story. 8 months on, the extensive business and cultural model that I wrote and rewrote several times for Heritage Fund is not entirely dead in the water, but it's pretty close. It's fortunate that we ran a feasibility called survival, worst case scenario, because that's where we are in survival, worst case scenario. But we've got some numbers that we put in last year. And so even though those numbers are uncomfortable, we've run the budget for today, which, you know, I never thought we'd be at that point, but yes, that's where we are. So funding partners have stepped in to help maintain the community and education program. And we've been able to run them through established local partnerships, a bit similar to James's partnerships. And so we've managed to maintain that very important communication with our immediate community. It's active and it's incredibly positive. We started a YouTube channel. We've put all of our programming on, still on Eventbrite. We're still selling tickets. We're still running our language program. We're still doing baby yoga. It's all online. It's all on our homepage as if it was an event. And so the speed with which we've done that is incredible, partly because we were doing the website and we just shifted gears. And we had a budget that we were just through at putting that in place. We were lucky. We still had some money available from the Heritage Grant to do that. So I think it's, without that database and without the funders, I think we would be in a really very different situation. And my goal as a business development and marketing communicator is to not rely on grant funding. But I think we would struggle to reboot if we didn't have those funding partners. So back to the business plan. I think the business plan is one of your assets. It's not something that you write that is put in a drawer. It's a live document that is meant to be flexible and dynamic and responsive. And if anything, the overuse of the word resilient, it needs to be resilient. And looking at the worst case scenario as well as the best case scenario is really important. The other reason to do the business plan and to think about all of those elements is that today, this morning, we just received notice that we got £20,000 from the Arts Council. It was a long shot, but that business plan was adapted and readapted, and under pressure, we put we punted that application in thinking there's no way we're going to get any money out of the Arts Council because we've never received money from the Arts Council, and we've got £20,000 today. So the business plan works for more than just your commercial rigor. It works to keep you engaged in what else you can do, and especially what to do when things go wrong. Also, assets, and then I'll wrap up, is that it's vital that there is a database available that keeps the conversation live and engaging. We have many, many forms of technology available to us now. And rather than seeing that as daunting, think about it as an extended conversation with the community you don't know and who doesn't know you yet. That's me.
Yes, thank you ever so much, Sarah. Much to think about and talk about after this session, but we'll turn now to Georgina. Thank you.
Thanks, Kath, and thank you for having me here. Interestingly enough, one of the church that Sarah just spoke about is one of my 88 churches. So I wholeheartedly agree with what she said, and it's a beautiful, beautiful space. As a Methodist and on Ascension Day today, I was reminded of a Charles Wesley hymn. And it says, a line in there says, "See, he lifts his hands above. See, he shows the prints of love." And I think in some ways, for me, that's what going forward for us is about. It's about that resilience, that our handprints are there. And I think, as Sarah said, it may not be that we have the income that we used to generate, but the gospel wasn't just about income. And I think, as James alluded to as well. So I look after 88 churches in the City of London and the City of Westminster. And as you can imagine, they're very different areas to look after. So Westminster is more parish based, and the city, we have 33 of those churches within 1 square mile. So most of the people that actually come to those churches also have their other church, or somewhere, as James said, that they will call church. So we've always had to look at how can we make sure that the churches in the city, notwithstanding the funds that they may have access to, are resilient. And in the City of Westminster, the same thing. And so Mary Magdalene's Paddington and the collaboration that it had with Paddington Development Trust, for example, and the Heritage Lottery Fund grant is a great example of that. But I also work very closely with the Bishop of London. She's our area bishop and obviously the diocesan bishop. And so one of the things for me is always to enable the bishop to speak with that prophetic voice. And then how do we do that? Through partnership, and sadly also through the thing that's not much fun to talk about, but actually, as Sarah said, really plays into this time now, is process. And for me, part of that process is business action planning and mission action planning. And for us, the two things have to go together. And if I could give an example of the work that we did in the city with the Corporation of London. So we're looking outside of our usual partners, and sometimes they're already around us and we don't necessarily see them. In the Corporation of London and one of our churches, St. Catherine Cree, we worked with to open a homeless night shelter, which, for prophetically speaking, enabled us to look at how do we show the love of Christ for all people. It enabled us to look at our vision for what do we do for people that are mostly hidden from the rest of us, whether they're night workers or homeless people, or people that actually are coming into the city whilst the city workers are going home. In opening the homeless shelter at St. Catherine Cree, it was a tripart project, in that it was the Corporation of London. They also chose a provider that was Providence Row Housing Association, and then we had the Archdeaconry and the church itself working together. And we were able to accommodate guests from the streets who wouldn't have had anywhere to stay in the city, and give them somewhere safe to go, and then put them into the system, so that they would actually then be able to be led to a more sustainable form of living. Now, that type of collaboration, what's happened is that it enabled us to really work well with our local authority, in that case, the Corporation of London, and working with the church to use the space that it has to bring in income, but more importantly, at the same time, to serve the people who are around us that maybe we don't always see. And I think James mentioned that too. It really is about that type of collaboration and who is your congregation. But at the beginning of all of that, we have to have the process. And part of that process for us as churches is usually, whether it's the mission action plan, as I said, the business action plan, but also the faculty process. And what we have seen during this time is that when churches haven't engaged in the faculty process beforehand, or put into place structures or contracts or leases or licenses that can really help them to build resilience at times like this. They are suffering because there is no recourse to be able to say, okay, well, what did we agree with our partners? What did we say if, as Sarah said, the worst case was going to happen? And although the faculty process and that type of focus is not really seen, again, it's about those prints that are everywhere that actually aren't seen but have a huge impact when it comes to whatever it is that you want to achieve. So if we have an idea about who we are as church in the city, if we have 33 churches, how can they all be resilient if they're all doing the same thing? So it leads back again to what James said about also working in partnership. And one of the things that we're really looking at in the city at the moment and across Westminster and the diocese as a whole really is how do we really cluster groups of churches and organisations together so that we can rely on each other. You know, as James said, we could try to run a gym, but guess what? The people that run gyms know how to do that best. But we do run cafes, and I think Sarah mentioned the cafe that's in St Mary Magdalene's. We've got cafe churches, we've got churches that look at the need in the community around them and then work out what is it that we would need to reach out to that community. That doesn't always translate into commerce. It doesn't always translate into money coming into the coffers. But then at times like this, when you reach out into the community, it's the same community that we've reached out to, whereby we will be able to serve them with food banks, with parcels that they need now during this time of COVID, to reach out to them with phone calls and conversations or online participation in conferences and in church. So when we have built that community, when we have built those partnerships, it gives us that stronger foundation to be able to move forward, whether it's good times or bad times, knowing that we are actually stronger together. And when our handprints are over the people that we deal with all the time, they don't go away when things like this happen. They still connect to us, but just in different ways. And that is what resilience is about. So how do we weather the storms? Because in good times, it's always easy to reach out to people who have money or congregations that come physically to your building. But if they don't actually feel connected to you, then why will they come to an online conference? Why will they still continue to give the money that's needed to run those churches? The heritage that we have, especially, I think, between Westminster and the city, we have mostly grade 1 listed buildings. And it's important that that heritage is here, not just for us to use, but for generations to come. So if we're just a building or a museum and we don't reach out into the community, that will never happen. But we also have to think that, particularly in the City of London, most of the people that come through there don't live there. They're tourists or they work there. And in fact, in the city, we probably got 2 parishes that actually have homegrown communities around them. And everybody else comes into the city and goes back home either as a tourist or as a worker. So how did we build relationships with any of those people, regardless of whether we know who they are or not, but so that when we do have that relationship, they feel welcome, and that will encourage them to come back. And it gets back to, sadly, the process part, which is, do we know what our mission is? And do we know what our business plan is? Because we don't have those 2 things together. We can have a great idea. We can have a cafe church that we've got one in the city that probably had a footfall of about 400 people a day. Now, we're not suggesting that we necessarily proselytize every single person that comes through the church, but if we don't know how to build a relationship with the people that formerly came into the church, how do we make sure that we're resilient enough to go forward when they're not physically coming into the church? So for me, it really is the same as my 2 panelists said, that we build community and we look at who our congregation is, but we make sure that we also have process in place to enable us to ride out the storms and flourish again, and maybe flourish in a different way. But it doesn't mean that what we had in the past, we have to keep all of it, and it doesn't mean we have to lose all of it either. And one last thing I would say before we move on to conversation is Sarah mentioned the funding bodies that we can reach out to. And in fact, Heritage Lottery Fund has told all of the previous recipients of grants now that they would like to help them through this period of time. Happy to hear about the Arts Council grant, Sarah, and a lot of the other funding bodies too are also reaching out to say, how can we help you? And so if you've already had a relationship with a funding body, it's a good way to know that you actually can turn to them in times of need when they can help you through these periods of when you're less able to cope on your own. But regardless of who it is, whether it's a local authority, whether it's a community organisation, we can't do it alone. And our prints are all over each other, and it's through community that we'll work well together and be resilient in the future. Thanks, Ken.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Georgina. Some really practical advice there. So thank you. Before we turn to our questions from the floor, I just wanted to give Sarah and James and Georgina just one last chance to respond to anything that they've heard from the panelists, and then we'll open it up to everybody. James.
I think I just want to pick up on something that Georgina just said about different funding bodies. I saw Rachel's comment in the comment section about getting some money from the district council to get a camera for the online services, and you know, this is a really useful time to be reflecting as churches on those the relationships that we have that have real depth, and often I think. Not often, sometimes, one of the markers of relationships that have depth is that people are willing to put their money behind it. And so if as a church you have received money from local bodies, grant funders, you know, individuals, that's not just a commercial transaction. I think for us as churches, we need to recognise that they are wanting to invest something in what it means for us to be church. And that's really valuable, actually. That's really valuable, and it allows us at times like this to, well, we should feel confident at times like this to then go back to those people and those bodies and those individuals and say, look, you've felt in the past, because you put money into this church, that what we offer is really important. We want to be doing that in the future. Times are difficult now. We'd like to offer you an opportunity to invest again, not just in the present, but in what's to come. And I think I would echo what Georgina's saying about us as churches having confidence about what we offer. So often, we don't have that confidence, but you know, we have a great big God, and we should be confident in what God is doing, and confident that even in the mistakes that we make as churches, God is still able to shine through, and that's attractive to people. And where people have invested money, that should give us confidence to go back on those relationships and talk to them again, but also seek to deepen that for I think future connections and future opportunities.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to add anything more, or shall we turn to the conversation?
No, I think I just pick up on that word that James used, be confident. If you don't ask, you're not going to get. So I think go back to those relationships that, you know, where you can pick up the phone and give an honest interpretation of where things stand, and you put those applications in. And even if you go for £20,000, you get 2,000, then that's a start. Be brave. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you to our panelists. We've now stopped the recording now, so we have